work out anyway. Okay, well then, hi everybody. this is your friend Gov from CAR from Los Angeles. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I couldn't have been in two places anyway. But I mean, my main job, I'm the lawyer in charge of the legal hotline. So of course, I'm always encouraging you to call the legal hotline anytime you have legal questions. We're there for you. Today, very specific topic, but I can answer questions on anything, is the fire hardening defensible space law and the form. It's very confusing. It's probably the most confusing form or law in the whole that you have to deal with on a regular basis. But I'm going to try to simplify it for you and make it easy. And you can, like I said, if you have any questions, just put them in chat, or you can unmute yourself, whatever you want to do. Couple of general points to make before I start. Remember, in California is divided into local fire responsibility areas where the local fire company has jurisdiction, and state fire responsibility areas where the state has jurisdiction, Cal Fire has jurisdiction. But regardless, whether you're in a local or state, there are fire hazard severity zones, okay? And there are 4 of them: very high, high, moderate, and nothing. So every one of us is either in a local or a state responsibility area, and every one of us is in either a high, very high, moderate, or no fire hazard severity zone. Okay, so we're all in one of those 4. Now, if you're in one of the top 2, if you're in a very high or a high, there are certain laws you have to comply with. You have to have defensible space. You have to comply with the state defensible space laws. Whether you're selling your house, buying a house, you're not moving, you're not doing anything, you're supposed to be in compliance. And if you're not in compliance, Cal Fire or the local fire company has the right to tell you you have to come into compliance. They can inspect you. They can tell you you're not in compliance, and these are the consequences if you don't bring your property into compliance. That's been true for a long time. Now, another thing is, and I don't even know whether it's true in your area, some places, some counties, some cities have local vegetation management ordinances that supplement the state law. So we're all under the state law, and all of us that are in a high or very high fire zone under the state law, we have to comply. In addition to that, some of us also are under a local law, and sometimes these local laws are even stricter than the state law as what does it mean to have defensible space, okay? So it's already complicated, right? But simplifying it, you're in one of those state zones. You may also have a local law, and you guys would know better than me whether where you are, there's any local county or city vegetation management ordinance. So that's the background. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about the actual disclosure law, okay? Because that's what we're here for today. So what I want to do is I'm going to share my screen and just pull up the form itself. Wait, hold on. Because that's the law created a form, basically, that we all have to that we all have to deal with. Okay. Share my screen. So we're all looking at the form now, right? You can see the fire hardening form. So I'm just going to go through it and really try to make it simple for you. The first paragraph on this form simply helps you figure out whether you need to do the form, right? In other words, this is a form that goes along with a sale. When you're selling a house, you might or you might not need to do this form. You don't need this form all your transactions. You only need this form in certain transactions. Now, One complicated thing is this form deals with two completely separate things. It deals with fire hardening and it deals with defensible space. So they're two separate laws that were combined into one form. Okay, so the first question you ask yourself, is my house, am I selling 1 to 4 units? Is it a TDS transaction? Is it in a high or very high fire zone? And was it built before January 2010? All right, so you know if the house is 1 to 4 units. Is a TDS required? Yes. If you're selling 1 to 4, a TDS is required unless it's a probate sale, REO sale, bankruptcy sale, or a sale by a trust if the trustee never was on title personally. So some transactions, even though they're 1 to 4 units, there's no TDS required. In that case, this form's not required either. But let's say it is 1 to 4, there is a TDS required. Then the important thing is it in a high or very high fire zone? If it's in a moderate zone or it's not in any zone, the form is not required. Okay? But if it's 1 to 4, a TDS is required and it's high or very high, the form's required. For defensible space, it says the exact same thing. So in other words, you got to deal with both of these things. But as far as the fire hardening part, that only applies if the house is built before 2010. So in other words, if the house is newer than 2010, even though it's 1 to 4, even though a TDS is required, even though it's in a high or very high fire zone, you don't have to fill out paragraph 2 on the fire hardening. You still got to do paragraph 3 on defensible space. So the issue of whether it was built before 2010 is only an issue for dealing with paragraph 2. Regardless of when the property was built, you always have to fill in paragraph 3 if it was 1 to 4, TDS, high or very high. Okay? So the next question is, how do I know if my listing is in a high or very high? How am I supposed to know that? Well, fortunately, we have this thing called natural hazard disclosure companies, and you use them in every single deal you do. And they have a form, the NHD form, and that form will help you figure out if your listing is in a high or very high fire zone. On the NHD report, as you know, on the cover page, there's 2 fire zones. There's a box for very high fire zones, and there's a box for wildland fire area. Okay, if the very high fire zone box is checked, you know your property's in a very high fire zone and you have to do this form. Okay, but let's say on the NHD report, the very high fire zone box is not checked. Well, what if the wildland box is checked? Well, that's telling you you're in a state responsibility area and you're either in a high or a moderate fire zone. Because if you were in a very high, that first box would have been checked. Okay, so I'm looking at my NHD report. The very high fire zone box is not checked, but the wildland box is checked. Well, that still doesn't tell you whether you're in a high or a moderate zone, right? It tells you you're in one of the two. But you need to know, am I in a high one or am I in a moderate one? Because if I'm in a high one, I need this form. If I'm in a moderate one, I don't need this form. So what do you do if your NHD report comes back and it checks the box wildland area? You have to investigate further. What you really have to do is talk to, I usually say, just talk to the NHD company. They usually know. They have checked. They know whether it's in a high or a moderate, and they will tell you, and you can trust them. But if they don't know for some reason, or they don't want to tell you, or whatever, then you go to this website. The CAL FIRE has a way where you can figure it out yourself. Like I said, usually the NHD person you're dealing with can help you to figure out whether you're in a high. Obviously, if you're in a very high, that's obvious. The box is checked. If that box is not checked, though, you have to check further with the NHD company, or you have to go look at the fire hazard severity zone, or you could actually probably call CAL FIRE, your local fire company. They probably know too. Here's some good news for you. The law is changing. Not yet. I mean, it hasn't taken effect yet, but the NHD report form is going to be changed. So there's going to be a new box on the NHD report for high fire zones. So when this happens, which unfortunately probably won't be till the end of the year, it'll say right on the NHD report whether you're in a high or a very high. You won't have to talk to your NHD person. You won't have to check with the CAL FIRE zone viewer, because it'll be right on the NHD report itself. That is not the case yet, though. That hasn't happened yet. Should be end of the year. Okay, for now, if your NHD report checks wildland area, or even if it doesn't check either box, I recommend you talk to NHD rep and say, okay, it's not clear from your report. Please tell me if my property is in a high or very high fire zone. So let's say your property is in a high or very high fire zone. Okay, it is. Well, then we know the form is required, right? Okay. Now that we figured out the form is required, we go to the next paragraph. Now, if the house was built after 2010, we skip paragraph 2. But assuming your house that's in a high fire zone or very high was built before 2010, then you got to do this paragraph. Now, 2A, you don't have to do anything. That's just information for the buyer to read. Paragraph B, the seller, the person who's selling this house that's in a high fire zone, built before 2010, not exempt from the TDS, that seller has to answer these 6 questions, yes or no. Are you aware? Some sellers don't even know. I don't know what the openings are in my vents here. I don't know if I have missing roof flashing. Most people usually know about their house, but some people don't. All they're asking, are you aware? As far as you know, seller, do you have a wood roof? Is there landscaping within 5 feet of the home? Do you have single pane windows? So in other words, you're going to check yes or no to the best of your knowledge. Now, the seller doesn't have to do anything. They don't have to change their roof. They don't have to put in dual pane windows. They don't have to cut back the landscaping. They don't have to do anything. They just have to tell the buyer, to the best of their knowledge, whether the property has these 6 things. Obviously, ideally, the answer is no to most of these questions. That's what the buyer wants, but the seller is not required to do anything to the house in order to sell it. Now, maybe the buyer is going to say, oh, I don't want to buy your house unless you put in dual pane windows. The seller can say, well, you buy it and put them in yourself. I mean, it's negotiable. Buyer can ask for things, right? Seller can say no. Seller doesn't have to do anything but answer these 6 questions, yes or no. Okay. But then we get to the second part, the more complicated. But this is where this buyer and seller have to actually do something. So far, this is just a disclosure form, right? You're telling the buyer that they're in a zone, and you're telling them that your property has certain features, okay? It's just a disclosure. But the paragraph 3 deals with defensible space, and this is more than just a disclosure. Now, remember, this paragraph is required even if the house is built after 2010. So if it's very high or high, TDS required 1 to 4, you need to do this. But by the way, before I go any further, some people ask me, should I just give this form to the buyer every single deal? I mean, what's the harm of just giving this form to every buyer, no matter if it's in a very high fire zone, I'm just going to give them the form. I mean, you could. I recommend against that because I think it's going to confuse some buyers. Because if you do that, is the seller going to answer these questions, even though they're not required to? And if you give it to the buyer and you don't answer the question, the buyer's going to say, why didn't you answer the questions? Well, I didn't really have to give you the form at all. To me, it's just confusing. To me, I would only give the form to the buyer if you're in a high or very high fire zone. You know what? We got another form called the Wildfire Advisory, WFA. That's a good informational form to give every buyer. I think that's a great idea. Whether you're in a high or very high or not, that's a great form. It's not a required form. It's just a good form, Wildfire Advisory. This form, I would only provide when it's required. And it's only required if you're in a high or very high. Okay? All right. So now we get to the all-important third paragraph. So we've dealt with this paragraph. If the house was built after 2010, we skipped this paragraph. We didn't have to do it. But we can't skip paragraph 3. So, first question. Remember I said all of us are subject to the state law, but only some of us are subject to a local law. So the first question the seller is being asked is this property that you're selling subject to a local law? Remember I said there's some local laws that are even stricter than the state law? So, So seller, you sort of should figure that out. Is there a local law? Who would I ask if I didn't know? I'd probably ask the fire company, or I'd ask CAL FIRE. They probably know if there is a local law that supplements the state law. So you simply answer yes or no. And whatever the answer is, you still got to fill out the rest of the paragraph. It doesn't really matter what the answer is. And you know what? If you don't know and you don't check it, to me, it's not a big deal. Okay? It's not really part of the crucial part of the law. Next question is, seller is being asked to tell the buyer, is the property in compliance with the state law or the local law if there is one? You know what my advice here is? My advice is I would always not check 2 or 3. In other words, it's perfectly okay to say as a seller, you know, I honestly don't know if this property is in compliance. It's perfectly okay to do that. I would only check this box, number 2, is if you already had an inspection within the last 6 months. And by the way, you're not required to do an inspection in the last 6 months. But if for some reason, there's some places like Big Bear down in LA, down in San Bernardino County, where there is a mandatory inspection they do every 6 months. So if I'm in Big Bear, I probably know if my property is in compliance because I've done an inspection in the last 6 months. But if you haven't actually done an inspection in the last 6 months, I wouldn't check this box. You could say, well, I'm pretty sure my property is in compliance. But are you 100% sure? If you have any doubt in your mind, why check the box? Why commit yourself saying you're in compliance? Or what if you know for sure you're not in compliance? How on earth would you know for sure you're not in compliance? Probably because you just got an inspection and the inspector said you're not in compliance. Most people, in my experience, have not had an inspection done recently, which means they really don't know if their property is totally in compliance. So generally, when you come to paragraph B, it's perfectly okay to just don't check either box. Just let it go to number 1. Okay? So that's one point I want to make. But now comes the most important part. This is sort of the confusing part, and that's paragraph C. All right? So now buyer and seller have to agree on something. So whether or not you're in compliance now, whether or not there is a local law, buyer and seller have to come to an agreement about what's going to happen next. And there's 6 possibilities. If you don't check any of the boxes, it defaults to number 1. Now, let's say you know that in wherever you are, Calaveras County, Tuolumne County, that there's no local ordinance. If there's no local ordinance, I would not check any of the boxes. I would just say, buyer, it's your responsibility within a year to make sure your property's in compliance. I'll come back later to say what that means. Now, another possibility is there is a local law. A lot of places have these local laws, but these local laws don't say you have to do anything special just because the property is selling. So in other words, if I'm a seller and I already checked is because there is a local law, then I'm probably going to check, I'm sorry, skip number 2. This is a rare thing. There is a local law, and it says when you sell the property, somebody has to obtain documentation of compliance. Somebody has to do an inspection before you can sell it. If there is such a law, you'll check this box. But maybe the local law allows either the buyer or the seller to do it. So you're basically saying, I want the buyer to do it. Okay. So once again, there aren't many places like this, but there's a local law in your area that says you can't sell a house here without doing something. But you can do it after close. Okay. This is unusual. This is only if there's a local law saying after close, you have to do something. And you're going to say it's a buyer's job. Other places have a local law which doesn't even mention a sale. It just says this is what you have to be in compliance with. So in other words, just because you're selling doesn't mean you have to do anything special right now. So in other words, under A, if the seller checked no, there's no local ordinance, I'm probably going to recommend just leave it at number 1. If the seller checks yes, there is a local ordinance, then I'm going to look at that local ordinance. Does that ordinance say I have to do, buyer has to do something after the sale? We'll check this box. Does that form say that nobody has to do anything just because you're selling? That doesn't change anything. Then I'm going to check this box. Now, even more unusual, there are some places in California, like Truckee, like Paradise, where there's a local law that says, seller, it's your job. You have to do something before close. Okay? There are very few places in California that require this. I don't know if where I'm talking to you right now, you have a local law, but there are, in my experience, I haven't heard of anything other than Truckee or Paradise that says in this city, you can't even sell the house until you first get an inspection done. So if that's the case, obviously you're going to check this box because the seller has no choice. Okay. Now, another possibility is you're in Big Bear and the seller, for some reason, has obtained an inspection within the last 6 months. In that case, you'll check this box and give it to the buyer. And the last one is, this is for the really nice seller. The seller is saying, even though I don't have to do it, there's no local law requiring me to do it, because I'm a nice guy or gal, I promise I'm going to give you some type of documentation. You know, a buyer could write that in their offer. The buyer could say, part of my offer is, seller, I don't want to buy your house. I don't want to remove my contingencies until you go out and get an inspection from the fire company or CAL FIRE and get some type of statement that you're in compliance. The buyer can always ask for that, and the seller can say no. The only time the seller has to do something is if there's a local law like Truckee or Paradise, which says you can't sell unless you do the inspection. The state law doesn't require that. But even if there's no local ordinance, right? I mean, CAL FIRE or the local fire company can show up at your property anytime they want. And they can say, oh, we've noticed your property's not in compliance. You better bring it in. We'll be back in 2 months. It better be in compliance or you're going to get fined or something. That can always happen. Whether you're in escrow, you're not selling, you just bought it. I mean, remember the first thing I said, your property has to be in compliance. Forget this law. This law has nothing to do with the fact that your property has to be in compliance. All this law is saying is when you sell a house that's high or very high, either the buyer or the seller has to take responsibility to verify that it's in compliance. Usually, unless you have a local ordinance like Truckee or Paradise, usually it's the buyer who is agreeing that within 1 year after close, they're going to reach out to either CAL FIRE or the local fire company and get an inspection. That's usually what's going on. If you're in Truckee or Paradise, they check this box and the seller has to do it. If you're in Big Bear, the seller already usually has documentation, so they just give it. And sometimes the seller, to make their house, some buyers say, I'm not going to buy your house unless you do it. You take care of it. And the sellers can be nice and agree, but sellers don't have to do that. And like I said, once in a while, there's a local law that supplements the state law that requires the buyer to do something after close. That's unusual too. Okay. Now, this last one also causes a bit of confusion because what is this talking about? This is only talking about the seller who actually built the house that they're selling, or they've done some type of major renovation. In other words, to build a house that's in a high or very high fire zone, or to renovate a house, to get a permit to do this, then that seller is going to have to prove that the property's in compliance with not just the defensible space, but also the fire hardening. So if your seller happens to be that person, they've actually built it or did the work and got a permit. Well, that means they've got some type of final inspection report, right? So they got that already. And if they have that, you're going to give it to the buyer naturally. Why wouldn't you want to give it to the buyer? Or if you don't have a copy, you tell the buyer where they can get a copy. So I think that's it. Remember that an important thing to remember about this disclosure is it does give the buyer a 5-day right of rescission after you give it to the buyer. So, in other words, don't delay giving this to the buyer, because if you wait till the middle of escrow before you give them the form, they got 5 days after that to back out of the deal. You want to give it to them early, just like you give them the TDS and the NHD and the seller property questionnaire and the lead paint form. These are the forms that give the buyer a right to rescind if within 5 days after they receive it. Okay, so it is a disclosure in that sense. So, are there any questions? I don't see anything in chat because you guys are mostly live. So does anyone want to unmute yourself and ask me something, or feel free?
Gov, I have one from Calaveras. Hang on just a second.
Okay.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
I'm Linda. I'm from Copper Valley Properties. We sell mostly new homes, new construction. So I wondered if you could talk about how this applies to the new construction contracts when we have a public
Yeah.
report.
This is not required. You're exempt from a
Thank you.
TDS, so you're exempt from this. By the way, one other thing I want to mention, I don't know if any of you guys sell like condos. So let's say you're selling like a condo and the owner of the condo doesn't even control the yard, the space. So how are they going to be in compliance? They can't even, they don't cut down trees or do anything like that. I mean, they don't have the control over that. The HOA has control over that. Does that mean they're exempt from this form? No, you still got to do the form, but you have no control over it. So you basically just say, here's the form, here's the information, we can't do anything, and it doesn't really matter how you fill out the form because the buyer can't do anything either. Once they close it, they can't get it inspected. It's not, they don't control. I mean, the law should exempt common interest developments. We're trying to get the law to exempt it. It doesn't. So give the buyer the form, but it doesn't really matter how you fill it out because neither the buyer nor the seller has any power to do anything. It shouldn't even be relevant, but nevertheless, fill out the form. Okay. Maybe Eric has a question, perhaps?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
How do I know if my local fire department is authorized to do the inspection? We had a bit of a disagreement. CAL FIRE really wanted to come in and our fire department said, no, we want to do it. How do we know if our department is authorized?
That's a great question. I would assume they would know if they're authorized. I mean, I haven't heard of any fire companies that aren't authorized. So maybe I can look into that, but I've never heard of that issue. In other words, I've always assumed that all fire companies do this, but maybe I'm wrong. I'll get back to you, Eric, but as far as I know, I would take their word for it. If they can do it, they can do it. Now, as far as which one's going to do it, remember, in a state fire responsibility area, in which case a local fire company has, but the local fire company can defer to CAL FIRE if they want to. I'm going to stop my video because I may be losing internet here. Okay, so anyway, so I'm not sure that it really helps you, but I've really honestly never been asked that question. I've never run into the issue of a local fire company not being authorized to do this. But I'll check into that further.
Thank you.
You're welcome. By the way, I see there are a couple things in Q&A. Kathy Collins. So essentially, this needs to be given to sellers when doing a list agreement. Right. In other words, as part of your listing process, you help you make sure the seller fills out the TDS. You make sure they fill out the seller property questionnaire. If it's pre-78, you make sure they fill out the lead paint form. You make sure they order an NHD report. And yes, if the property's in a high or very high fire zone, you give this form to the seller. Now, maybe what you're asking is, whose responsibility is it to figure out whether the property's in a high or very high fire zone? Is that the sellers or the listing agents? Well, it's technically the sellers, but they think of you as their helper. You're the expert. You're the one they're relying on you to help them, right? So they're going to rely on you to figure it out. So that means you're the one who's going to talk to the NHD provider and tell them. Remember, the good news is by the end of the year, the NHD form itself is going to be very clear right on the form whether you're in a high or very high fire zone. Now, Janine Murray has a great point. The buyer's insurance company won't insure unless the property is in compliance. I mean, overriding everything I said is the insurance issue. And more insurers are basically saying, we don't care about this form or not. We don't care if there's a local law or not. We're taking the position as an insurance company that we are not going to insure this property if it's not in compliance. So if the insurance company says that, everything I just told you in the last half hour, forget it. You have to bring the property in. The seller really has to reach out and get an inspection if they want to sell the house. Unless the buyer can find some other insurance company that won't require that. But if the buyer needs to get buyer's not going to buy the house without insurance. And if the only way they can get insurance is if this property has been inspected and determined to be in compliance, that's going to override everything I just told you. And to make the house sell, the seller's going to have to go out and get an inspection. I mean, that's an overriding point. I probably should have even mentioned that before. Now, let's see, in chat, yeah, same questions. So, okay, so I've got those questions. By the way, I'm going to put in my, I don't know if anyone can see this. I'm going to give everyone my email address. You can always call the legal hotline, but I'm at govh@car.org. If anything ever comes up for you, not just on this, on anything, you can call the hotline. You can always email me. I respond to all emails and about everything. So remember, the big new thing that's coming is the change in the NHD report. Other than that, I don't think anything is going to change on this form coming up. It's complicated, but I hope I simplified it a little bit. I think it was recorded, so you can go back and look at this if you want. We've also got we did a webinar on this that's on our website. You can look at that too. Let's see. Sean, I don't see any more questions. So I might be done.
I don't have any questions here at Calaveras.
And if there are none from Tuolumne, I guess I'm going to say everybody have a nice lunch. If you haven't already eaten.
We're sad you did the tacos, Gov.
Oh, look, I wish I were there.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll see you guys in person one of these days. I'd be glad to come out to either one of or both of these where you are, if it works with my schedule. So today didn't work with my schedule, but so keep in touch.
Well, we'll invite you back.
Yeah. I can come talk about all the other new stuff too, if you want. So let me know. Okay, then.
Thank you, Gov.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye.